All right, let's get right into it. We've all seen the headlines about violence in Nigeria, and it's so often boiled down to this simple idea of a clash over land. But, the reality is so much more complicated and honestly, so much more devastating. In this explainer, we're going to peel back the layers of a conflict that is really tearing at the very soul of Africa's most populous nation. I want to start with just one number: 3,641. According to Amnesty International, that is how many people were killed in this conflict in just 2 years, between 2016 and 2018. Now, to put that into perspective, this conflict has actually become deadlier than the Boko Haram insurgency. But a number that huge, it can be hard to wrap your head around. So let's make it personal. To really understand the horror behind that number, just read this. This is testimony from a survivor of an attack in Plateau state, someone who was hiding in a school classroom. This isn't just some abstract statistic. This is a classroom turned into a killing field. It's the real human cost of a crisis we absolutely need to understand. So, what's the story we're usually told? Well, the most common explanation, one you hear all the time, centers on this timeless conflict, a fight for land and for resources. So let's quickly break down the two main groups involved here. Okay, so on one side, you've got sedentary farmers. They're largely from various Christian ethnic groups, and their entire livelihood is tied to a specific piece of fertile land where they grow their crops. Then on the other side, you have nomadic herders, who are primarily Fulani, a Muslim ethnic group. Their whole way of life depends on movement, on guiding their cattle across the land to find pasture. On the surface, it really is a classic struggle between two different ways of life competing for the exact same finite resources. And this age-old struggle is being absolutely supercharged by what's happening to the environment. You've got desertification up in the north that's pushing herders further and further south, right into farming communities. At the same time, droughts are shrinking the water sources for everyone, and cities are expanding, just eating up land that used to be for farming or grazing. It's a total perfect storm, creating this intense pressure cooker of competition. But here's the thing. If this was just about land and water, it wouldn't explain the sheer brutality, the scale of the violence that we're seeing. To really get what's going on, we have to peel back another layer of this conflict, and this one is much, much older. And right here, you can see just how deep these divides go. This conflict, it doesn't just map onto land use, it maps almost perfectly onto ethnicity and religion. The farmers, they're typically from indigenous Christian groups who see themselves as indigenous, people with ancestral rights to that specific land. The herders, they're overwhelmingly Fulani Muslims, and they're often viewed by those local communities as foreigners or occupiers, even if their families have lived in that region for generations. And this is the crucial point, captured perfectly in this analysis. The violence itself becomes the catalyst. Every single attack reinforces these ethno-religious fault lines. A simple dispute over a destroyed crop, it's not just between a farmer and a herder anymore. No, it's seen as an attack by the Muslims on the Christians, or the other way around. And the suspicion and the hate, they just spiral out of control. So if resource scarcity and these deep-seated identity politics are the fuel and the spark, what's the accelerant? What's the thing that turns a local dispute into a massacre that kills hundreds of people at a time? Well, that brings us to the absolute core of this explainer. The single most critical factor, the one that so many analysts point to, is the failure of the Nigerian state. This is what transforms a simmering crisis into an explosive all-out war. To really get this, we need to quickly look at a key concept. And that brings us to something called state failure theory. Now, it might sound academic, but the idea is actually pretty simple. A state is considered failed when it can no longer provide the most basic thing to its citizens: security. It loses control, it can't enforce its own laws, and it can't protect its own borders. Does that sound at all familiar? Because this is exactly how it's playing out in Nigeria. The country's borders are porous, they're like a sieve, allowing this flood of foreign fighters and really sophisticated weapons, like AK-47s, to just pour in. And when attacks do happen, security forces are often incredibly slow to respond, that is, if they respond at all. And this is crucial, there are almost never any arrests or prosecutions. This creates a culture of total impunity where people believe they can get away with murder. All of this creates a vacuum, and in a vacuum, violence always thrives. Now let's look at the real-world impact of this failure. In Benue state, a place known as the food basket of the nation, massacres have become tragically common. Think about this. 71 people were killed in the very first week of 2018 alone. In Plateau state, the brutality is just shocking. In one attack, 50 people, and we're talking women and children here, were burned to death inside a pastor's home where they had run for safety. Over in southern Kaduna, the attacks are just relentless and ferocious. I mean, can you imagine over 100 of your neighbors being slaughtered in less than a week? This is the terrifying reality for communities in Atyap land. And it's really important to see that the desperation and the violence, it flows in all directions. In Taraba State, for instance, reprisal attacks and clashes forced 23,000 Fulani herders to flee their homes and become refugees in neighboring Cameroon. Nobody is safe in this. Now, you might be thinking the government has done nothing, but this timeline shows a long history of flawed interventions. For decades, plans have been proposed, from grazing reserves way back in the 60s to the more recent Ruga plan, but every single one has ultimately failed, either because of poor implementation or just a complete and total lack of trust from the people on the ground. So how does this all lock together? How do all these different factors, the environment, identities, state failure, how do they feed off each other to create this seemingly unbreakable cycle of violence? Well, here's how it locks together into this devastating, vicious cycle. Step 1. Climate change intensifies competition for land and water. Step 2. This competition maps directly onto those old, deep ethno-religious divides we talked about. Step 3. The state, the one entity that should be keeping the peace, fails to provide any security or justice, leaving communities feeling completely abandoned. And that, of course, leads to Step 4, a total breakdown of trust, where communities arm themselves for self-defense, which leads to reprisal attacks and an even greater flood of illegal weapons. Each step just makes the next one worse. And the results isn't just a human tragedy. It is a full-blown economic catastrophe. The states most affected by this violence have lost nearly half of their own revenue. And for the federal government, the estimated loss is a staggering $13.7 billion every single year. This conflict is literally bleeding the country dry. This quote from Samuel Ordom, the governor of one of the hardest-hit states, it really says it all. The responsibility, in his view, and the view of so many people on the ground, lies squarely with the state's failure to act. This violence wasn't inevitable. It was allowed to happen. So we're left with this question, right? This isn't just a conflict over land anymore. It's a crisis of identity, it's a crisis of security, and it's a crisis of faith in the state itself. When that social contract is completely broken and communities are left to fend for themselves, how do you even begin to rebuild? What path to peace is even left?